Oh, okay. All right, let's get started. Okay, so first, a few announcements. Exam 2 has been graded. It's been released to you on Gradescope. And here are some numbers. The mean was very comparable to the first exam. The median is a little lower, but not by much. And the total also, everything looks very nice. Most of you did very well. This is what the histogram of this course looks like so far. There is still a lot of grading to do. We only have 66 points here, but there's the exam 3 and the other homeworks. Okay. I'll post about this on NetStem for you to have a reference for them in any case. And you also have about a week to submit regrade requests for exam 2. The TAs will handle them directly. Okay. All right. So last class we were talking about designing context-free grammars, and we showed that context-free grammars are not, not wild. They are actually computable. You can simulate them with Turing machines. In particular, given a grammar G, a Turing machine can convert it into Chomsky normal form, and once you do that, we know how to check whether or not a string is in the language corresponding to the grammar, right? We could just do some kind of brute force enumeration, and we know that we have to cut off at some point, and we can because of the Chomsky normal form. Okay, and we saw a recursive code for that in the last lecture towards the very end. We showed that for any grammar G, the context-free grammar, the function corresponding to the grammar is computable just from this recursive code. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do today is kind of start exploring the space of context-free grammars more, and then we'll start talking about questions beyond Turing machines. What are their implications for other areas and so on. All right. So what have we learned about context-free grammar so far? More powerful than DFAs. Okay, and we also saw that CFGs are computable. The second one perhaps is not too surprising, but we did see a way to do it. Okay, but are there any limitations of context-free grammars? Right, so right from the beginning, whenever we introduce a computational model, we were talking about, is this all we need? What are the limitations besides the particular motivation, right? So context-free grammars, as we said, are very useful in the context of programming languages and things like that. But are there any limitations of context-free grammars? And it turns out that there are. So there are simple languages that are not context-free. Meaning, there are languages which cannot be computed by a context-free grammar. And here's an example, kind of surprising example, really. So remember, we saw that the language of palindromes, strings that read the same forward and backward, was not regular, right? So we showed that using the pumping lemma for DFAs. But we also showed that that language is context-free. We designed a simple grammar which was generating palindromes. But a seemingly related language, which is the following, is not context-free. So plain Okay, so the simple language of double, where I just have a string, a semicolon, and then repetition of the string itself. So the same string occurring twice, but I'm putting a semicolon just for ease for us. The language, even when I drop the semicolon, is going to be not context free, but it's easier to study this language. So for instance, something like 0, 0, 0, 0, or 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1. These are all in double. Okay, the same string is being repeated with a semicolon in between. And this language is not context free. Try as you might, it is very tempting to attempt context designing a grammar for this, but it is not possible to come up with a context free grammar for this simple language. Okay, it seems very like, very much like something that we already have, very close to palindromes too, right? It's just, instead of repeating the front and back being the same, you just have the same piece occurring twice. Okay, so why is this? Why is this language not context free? Why can't I come up with some clever set of rules to generate this language? And fortunately, there's a clean answer to this. Just like we had the pumping lemma for context free grammars, there is something similar just like we had the pumping lemma for regular languages, we have something similar for context free grammars. Okay, so there is a tool that we can use to reason about whether or not a language is context free, and in particular to prove that certain languages are not context free, and that is the pumping lemma. Okay, just as the pumping lemma for regular languages, this is a tool for proving that certain languages are not context free. So the statement of the lemma is a bit more, it's very similar to the pumping lemma that we had, but is a bit more nuanced. Okay, so the lemma, so let me say it, the pumping lemma for CFGs. We know that the original pumping lemma that we had for DFAs, that cannot be true for context-free grammars, because we had languages which, like palindromes, which are context-free, but which cannot be pumped. Right? So the statement of the lemma is the following: for every grammar G, there exists a number P, okay, such that any string X in the language of length such that for all X greater than or equal to P, X can be written as follows. So for DFAs, we said, okay, when there is some number P, so that for any string X of length more than P, I can break it up into 3 parts such that the middle part can be pumped. Right? That's the gist of the pumping lemma. So here, for context-free grammars, that is not true, but you can split up the string into 5 pieces, okay, such that 2 pieces can be pumped in coordination. So what does this mean? I can write X as A, B, C, D, E. Okay, there are 5 pieces, and these 2 are the important pieces, such that 1, Okay, so I can pump the second and third piece in coordination. Intuitively, this happens because in context-free grammars, I can synchronize the strings. I can synchronize the ways of generating strings on two ends. So this is exactly capturing that phenomenon. Saying any string X can be split up into 5 pieces such that the second and fourth piece can be pumped. Right? And the length of BB is greater than 0. Finally, length of BCB is less than or equal to P. Okay, so that's it. So this is recall. Okay. So it's in the same spirit as the pumping lemma for regular languages, but we have X. Now it's being split up into A, B, C, D, E. Okay. And what it's saying is, okay, so you need to have A, B, C, D is in L. That's the original hypothesis. And not only that, but we should have A, C, D is in L, A, B squared, C, D squared, E is in L, and so on. Any questions about this statement? Yeah?
So the number of B's and the number of E's does not have to be equal.
They have to be equal. It's the same I. That's important, actually.
So ACBs.
Both are, oh, sorry. You're right. Thank you. B should have been E. Thanks. Yeah. When I said I equals 0, B and D disappear. Okay? So that's it. So we are not going to prove this lemma, but the proof is, somewhat similar, where you do some kind of counting of the number of rules in the context-free grammar, and so on and so forth. There's a question: is the Scribble link working in the chat? It should be. Yeah, I think it should be. So that's it. So that's the pumping lemma now. And let's see one use case of it, right? And also, as a reminder, once again, when we think of it as a game, if you're trying to prove a language is not context-free, you do not get to pick P. Someone else tells you, here's my number P. You can't say, okay, I'm going to assume P equals 10 and show that it cannot be pumped for that. P can be a million, billion, whatever. We can't have control on that. But once someone tells you P, you get to pick the string X that you are trying to show cannot be pumped in this particular way. All right? The underlying logic is similar. So we want to say that to prove a language is not context-free, you need to show that for all P, there exists a string X such that for all ways of splitting X as A, B, C, D, E, no pumping possible. Okay, so if I want to show some language is not context free, I need to show that for all integers P, there is some string X such that no matter how you split it up, you're not going to be able to pump it. Right? So this order of quantifiers again is just as important as it was for proving that languages were not regular. Okay. All right. So let's see it in action. Just one example here because it's very similar to when you apply it. The logic is usually similar to what we did for regular languages. And most of the ingenuity again is in coming up with the candidate string X that you're trying to show cannot be pumped. Okay, so theorem double is not context. Okay, meaning what was double? That was this language. All right. And as I said, this is true even without the semicolon, but it's easier to prove this when you have the semicolon. All right. So for proof by contradiction, suppose double was context free, meaning there was a context free grammar computing it, right? Means there exists a number P such that PL for CFGs holds. Okay. Now we are faced with the first and main question, which is what should the string X be? What string X should I take so that it becomes harder to pump? Any suggestions? So we need the same string. We need the same string occurring twice, right? And then we have a semicolon. This is X. What should I take my string to be so that I can get a contradiction easily? So the idea is roughly the following. Somehow I can use, just as we were doing for pumping limo, we can use this condition to pump only one of 0 or 1. Okay, somehow we were saying that B had to be only zeros, B had to be only ones. We can try and do something like that. Okay, so let me tell you what will work. The string X I'm going to take has P zeros followed by P ones. And the same thing here. Okay. All right. Now, so this is the candidate string. I've made my choice. I have to live with it now, and I have to argue that there is no way to split it up into pieces. All right, let me try one last time. So you want to say that there is no way to split it up into pieces, like A, maybe B here, and then C, and then D and E. Okay. So remember that I cannot assume much about the way to splitting it up, right? There is no constraint. A could be empty, C could be empty, B could be empty, E could be empty, D could be empty. The only things we know are that B and D together cannot be empty, because then pumping would be trivial, like it would not change anything. And the length of the middle B, C, D pieces put together is small. Okay. So pretty much the only thing that we know are that B and D together are not empty, and BCD is of length more than P, meaning it cannot, like, it has to fall in a small window. All right. How can I prove that you cannot find a way to split this up so that I cannot pump? Okay. So the proof is a little small case analysis. So what's the case analysis? The nice case is when B and D are on either side of the code. Okay, so let's do a case analysis. So the semicolon that we have, where does that lie? If that belongs to C, that's one case. If it belongs to the left of C, that's another case. To the right of C, that's another case. Okay. So what if B and D do not contain the semicolon and they're on either side? So what can we say then about B and D? Yeah.
So if we keep increasing I, then in the first W you have numbers, and then the second one you have zeros increasing, and they will not.
Exactly, right? So that's perfect. So what happens now is, by condition 3, that the length of BCD is less than or equal to B, P, B must be all ones, right? So this whole piece, BCD, is small length, and the semicolon is sitting here. So there's a tiny segment somewhere sitting here, right? So B has to be only ones, and D must be all zeros. To be empty, but one of them is not empty. And now when we pump, as pointed out, the left string, by left I mean the string next to the left of the semicolon, will have more ones than the right. Right? So in particular, A, B squared, C, D squared, E cannot be in the language, right? Because when B has only ones, D has only zeros. And when I increase B, I'm increasing the number of ones in the first half and increasing the number of zeros in the second half, right? Which means that I'm not matching them together. Yeah?
So either B or D.
Yeah, but not both. Yeah. Okay. That's one case. And the other cases are similarly easier. So let's say, the other case is B and D are on same side of the semicolon. Okay. So what does this mean? Somehow my string really looks like, I'll split it up. This was my X, but now the way I split it up is, A, let's say B, C, D, and then E is everything else. Okay, so B and D are on the same side. They're both on the left side of the semicolon. So there was a question in the chat, just to make sure, the semicolon is just for clarification, it is actually not in the string. No, semicolon is actually in the string for now, but there is a way to make the same argument work even when semicolon is not in the string. Okay, but that involves more case analysis. putting a semicolon in the string makes it easier to show that it is not context free. Easier just by a few cases, like, you need to handle 2 or 3 more cases, which is, kind of taking us away from the main point. But that's a good question. Okay. So B and D are on the same side, let's say. What's the problem with this? What happens if I pump now? Yeah? Yeah, exactly, right? So now A, B squared, C, B squared, E, the left side is longer than right side of the semicolon, right? So implies A, B squared, C, B squared, E is not in the language. Okay. And finally, there's a third case, which is probably the easiest case, is maybe instead of, we were considering cases where B is on one side, D is on one side, or they're on the same side, but what if they actually contain the semicolon? Yeah? Yeah, exactly. So now if I pump, I just end up with multiple of those, which is definitely not in the language. Okay? So you go ahead. Yeah. So what happens in case 1 is we are saying the picture somehow looks like this, right? Let me maybe change it a little. Okay. So the case here is that B and D are on either side of the semicolon. So imagine I'm splitting this up. B and D are on 2 sides, but their length is at most P. Each one has length at most P. So if B is going here and D is going here and the length is at most P, then B must be all ones. Okay, and D must be all zeros. Like somehow they're matching exactly like this. And when I pump now, I'm going to increase ones on the left hand side and increase zeros on the right hand side. So I added more ones, more zeros, but then the left and right won't match. Yeah? Right, so BCD combined is smaller than P, which implies that each piece individually is also less than P. Right, so we are kind of using everything there, but so together everything is less than P. That means that at the very least, this one cannot cross into the zeros. Okay. So 3 put together have length at most P. So B in particular also cannot have length more than P. It should be smaller. It could be that maybe it's significantly smaller, but it doesn't matter too much for us. Okay. Right. So together, these 3 cases imply that we have a contradiction. Contradiction by the pumping lemma. Okay, which implies that double is not context free. Okay. So we're not, as I said, not going to prove the pumping lemma for context-free grammars, but let's take it for granted for now. Okay. So we kind of saw that there are some limitations of context-free grammars, just as there for regular languages, but they are definitely more powerful than regular languages. Okay. Now let's compare them to Turing machines in a more abstract way. So what do I mean? Okay. So remember, there was this really surprising theorem that we saw for Turing machines, right? Given any Turing semantic property of a Turing machine, it is uncomputable. If I ask you to tell me whether or not, okay, this program does something, I cannot answer that. Unless it's a trivial question, which always says 0 or 1. Any question about the what some functionality of the Turing machine, that I cannot answer. That is not computable. But what about restricted models of computation, like context-free grammars? Can I start, maybe potentially reason about them? If I give you a grammar and I tell you, is this a grammar that computes the majority function? Can I answer that? Is this a grammar that actually, is the language of the grammar not empty? Can I answer that? Does the grammar accept any string that's not empty? Can I answer that? Things like that. Okay. So just as we defined semantic properties for Turing machines, we can also define semantic properties for context-free grammars. So what do I mean? So given any function, just as before, we're going to take a bit string as input, but we're going to interpret the bit string as a context-free grammar that takes a grammar G as input, is semantic if the following holds. So what should hold? So what did semantic mean? That semantic meant that somehow it should be a function of what the input is computing, right? So imagine I write a grammar, but then I add some dummy rule which doesn't touch any of the other rules. It doesn't change what the grammar is computing. Okay, and a semantic property is something which would not change based on this, irrelevant rules or irrelevant information. If for all grammars G comma G prime that are equivalent, that is the languages of the two grammars are exactly the same, okay. So it's the same as the semantic notion of semantic property for Turing machines, but we're only asking it for grammars. And the input strings are being interpreted as grammars instead of Turing machine. There's a difference there. So we're kind of taking a subset of the programs that we can see. Simpler programs, those that are only computable by context-free grammars. And we're asking, can you reason about them? Tomorrow I give you a grammar, and ask you, can you tell me whether or not this exactly computes the majority? Yes or no? Does this exactly compute parity? Yes or no? Can you tell me these things? Okay. Maybe you say, okay, I found a new grammar which generates the same language as the current Python programming language. Can we verify that that is the case? Okay. Can you give me an example of a semantic property? So let me say as a remark. We are viewing grammars as elements of 0 1 star. Okay, and just as we did for circuits and Turing machines, we can always associate any grammar with a single 0 1 star string, and by kind of the same sort of encoding, but we don't have to go into the specific process here. The way you exactly write it down, that's never important in many of these results. So can you give me an example of a semantic property of grammars that might be interesting for us? So question, okay, maybe let's do an example. So I'm going to define not empty, but I'm going to put a CFG here to distinguish it from what we had before. Not empty is a function which takes a grammar as input. Okay, and okay, so not empty of the grammar is 1 if there is some string in the language of the grammar, and 0 otherwise. So for instance, let's say my grammar is the rules A goes to 0A. Okay, and we have one variable. The terminals are 0, 1. These are the rules, and the starting variable is A. Okay, so this is my grammar. For whatever reason, I wrote down these rules. Is this grammar, is there a string that belongs to the language generated by this grammar? Can I ever reach any string X which is only terminals by applying these rules? No, right? Because whenever I start from the starting variable A and apply any rule, I will always have a variable A. There's no way to get rid of it. Okay, so here not empty of G is 0, meaning the function computed by the grammar is actually identically 0. It never accepts any string. All right. And we've seen many examples of not empty grammars. You know, maybe even here, if I just put 1, the variables are A, the terminals are 0, 1, These are my rules. The starting variable is A. Okay. Here, this language is not empty. For instance, just the string 1 belongs to the language because I can generate 1 starting from the start symbol. So this is the language of this grammar is not empty. Okay. Any questions about this? And this is a semantic property, right? Any two grammars which complete the same function, whether have the same language, the output of not empty will be the same because it really depends on the entire language, not on the specific implementation or specific rules or variables you might have in your implementation. All right. And when we talked about semantic properties earlier, we said, those are some of the most important computational tasks we face in day-to-day computer systems. I want to know whether this program is going to terminate. I want to know whether this program actually does what it's supposed to do. We couldn't do any of those things for Turing machines. But what's the scenario for context-free grammars? And fortunately, some semantic properties at least are computable, are solvable for context-free grammars. That's why we kind of reduce the power of the model. By reducing the power of the model, we increase our ability to reason about them. It's kind of, instead of increasing my power about reasoning about Turing machines, I'm going to start looking at simpler models of computation. Okay. So there's a question, shouldn't it be equal to 0? It should be 1. Basically, it is not empty. Whenever the language is not empty, you say it's 1. And when it's empty, you say it's 0. All right. So the main takeaway reducing power of model allows us to reason about that. Okay. I mean, I'm sure we see this in real life too. When we reduce the power of some systems, like you're trying to debug a system, you start taking your functionalities to figure out what's wrong with it at some point, right? Something along the similar lines is happening here. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that the function not empty CFG, there is some algorithm to solve that problem. Okay, and as it turns out, there's a very simple algorithm for it, and many of you probably have seen it in like CS31, CS32, CS180 in some form or the other. So I want to say, here's an algorithm for not empty CFG. Okay, so what's the goal? The input is a context-free grammar G. I give you a context-free grammar G, meaning I give you the rules, the variables. We are really given a binary string, but let's ignore all these annoying technicalities and assume that we actually have this. variables, terminals, rules, start. Okay? And you have to tell me, is LG empty or not? Okay? And you can think of it in a high level programming language. Can you tell me, can you write me a Python program which can solve this question of checking whether or not a given set of rules actually is able to generate some string? Okay. So let's take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we'll try and solve this question and then move on. Okay. So any ideas on how I can check whether or not a grammar is empty? So what is it really saying, right? I need to be able to reach a string which is only terminals given my set of rules. For instance, when I see the first string, somehow I need to conclude that there is no way you get a string with only zeros and ones when I apply the rules. There is no way to get rid of an A in the grammar. In the second case, there is. How can you tell that? Any ideas? You have seen something like this, I'm sure. For instance, if I give you a graph and I ask you, okay, can I get from point A to point B in the graph? How would you answer that? You can do like a breadth first search or a depth first search, right? So you can do something similar here. Intuitively, when we say, can I reach a string of only terminals, those are like a destination. Somehow I need to get rid of all the variables. Okay, so the idea, we need to check whether or not from the starting symbol I can get to string X of only terminals. Can be. Okay. Is there a way to reach a string of only terminals? Okay. And so here's the algorithm. I'm going to write it as a pseudocode really. And the way I'll do it is, imagine you start marking things, right? Kind of start backwards, that I need to check whether I can go from the starting symbol to something only having terminals. So let me start backwards. I'll first mark all the terminals. Those are good. And now any variable which has a rule which goes to terminals, that's also good. Whenever I get that variable, I can get rid of it, because I can apply that rule which takes me only to zeros and ones, or to terminals. Okay, and then I can keep repeating this, right? Basically, there is something like, let's say my rules are, S goes to 0SA, 0S B, then A goes to A1/1, B goes to BA/01, let's say. So here, actually, so let's say I have something like this. Then A is a good variable for us because it goes to only something that only involves terminals, right? So we can mark that and then start with that, okay? All right, so what I'm going to do is mark all terminals as good, okay? So you start by marking all terminals as good, meaning if I reach them, I'm done. And while any changes made, if there is a variable which has a rule to already marked variables, I'll mark that variable as good too. Okay. So if a variable A has a rule that only has good symbols on right, mark A as good. Okay, that's it. So maybe let me change this example a little bit to make it more interesting. And just writing some random rules really. Okay, so let's say these are my rules. Now in the first run, I would say, okay, mark 0 and 1. Okay, now you check all the rules. Is there any rule which only has marked symbols on the right? There is, right? C to 1 is a rule where 1 is marked on the right. So the next step, you mark C as good. Okay, so now C is good. When you go back, you check again, does S go to any rule which only has marked ones? Does A has a rule like 1C or 0C, both of them are good now. So mark A. Yeah. We can, right? I mean, it's not necessary for the grammar to be in Chomsky normal form always. Yeah, but that's another thing we could try. First make the grammar to Chomsky normal form and do this reduction, but it doesn't help us too much. So I'm not doing that here. Yeah. Yeah, so we don't know if B is good, but that's fine for us, right? In fact, if B was a start variable, we would be in trouble, I think. I mean, B has no rule really, so it's just like going nowhere. Okay. All right. So we mark A, and then we see, like, is there any other rule which can help us? Is there any other rule which can help us mark a new variable? S to 0A, right? So that's only going to mark things. So that's basically the algorithm now. So you mark terminals as good, and you mark any variable which only goes to good ones. Say that one is good, and keep propagating goodness. Yeah? That's fine, right? Because we don't have to apply this rule. We could choose to apply this rule. As long as there's some way to get rid of the variables, we are fine. It doesn't have to be that all rules lead to a string. Yeah? Oh, so this is for a single rule, right? So remember, this is shorthand for multiple rules, right? This is really C to BA and C to 1. Yeah, for a single rule. Yeah, that's a good point. Like, what I really mean is you should think of this as C to BA and C to 1. Right? Yeah. Okay. And finally, what should we check? We do this marking thing until you don't make any more changes, and the grammar is not empty if the starting symbol is marked good. Okay, so if S is marked as good, output 1, else output 0. Okay, so that's it. Okay, so this is an algorithm to check whether or not a grammar is can lead to a terminal string. So not empty is computable. Not empty is computable for context-free grammars, but as we saw earlier, it is not computable for Turing machines. So there is something nice about context-free grammars. If you try to do something similar with transition functions for Turing machines, it won't work. You'll end up with some weird circular loop. It's just not going to work. Okay. So just as a summary, some properties of CFGs are computable. Okay. But as it turns out, the sum is actually really sum. Not all properties of context-free grammars are computable. It's much more non-trivial to show, and we are not going to do this here, but let me say, and it's very counterintuitive. So let me define a semantic property which seems close to not empty, but it isn't. So it's is full. So is full is a property which takes a grammar as input and is just going to check, is the language of the grammar every string? Okay. So is full of G equals 1 if if the grammar can generate every possible string, then we say its language is full. So it's full. Otherwise, it's not. So for example, suppose I say my grammar is S goes to 0s, 1s, 0/1/epsilon. Okay, actually, maybe I can make it even simpler. So if this is my grammar, then you can generate any string in this grammar. Right? So is full of this grammar is 1. Right? On the other hand, let's say I say S goes to 1s/epsilon. Okay, this grammar only generates strings with 1, so it's not full. And this is a semantic property as well, right? It only depends on what the grammar is, what's the function being computed by the grammar, and not the exact rules you might have, right? So even if I add some dummy rules here, like let's say maybe A goes to BC, all of that stuff, the functionality is not going to change. Okay. So surprisingly, at least when I first saw this, I was shocked. Is full is uncomputable. Okay. So we are not going to prove this. So I can check, very fast, even whether or not the language of a grammar is empty, but there is no computer, there is no algorithm that can check whether or not the language of a grammar is everything. All right. Does this make sense? So there are some semantic properties of grammars which are computable, some which are not. So for Turing machines, we had this absolute dichotomy, right? Any non-trivial, any real semantic property, as long as it's non-trivial, is uncomputable. Here, it's a bit more mixed. You have to really check at the property and see whether or not it's true. So there's a question in chat: if not empty is computable with Python program, why is not computable? Why is it not computable by Turing machines? Oh, not empty is computable by Turing machines. That's definitely true. But the statement here is only for is full. It's not for not empty. So not empty is computable, but in a very sort of mind-boggling way, is full is uncomputable. Okay, and I think the question in the chat is hinting at the following confusion, right? If I ask you to check whether a language is empty or not, then it's okay. So let me say it this way. So we saw that regular languages were closed under complement, right? And we also saw that Turing machines are closed under complement. Like if I have a function which is computable by Turing machine, then not of that function is also computable. If I have a function which is computable by a DFA, then not of that function is also computable. But how about context-free grammars? If I give you a grammar, if I give you a language which is computable by a context-free grammar, is the complement of that language computable by a context-free grammar? Yeah? Okay, so for the first one, that would generate all possible strings, right? Because I can look at my sequence of zeros and ones, right? And if it's s goes to 0, s goes to 1 or 1s slash epsilon, I can keep generating the string and then replace s with epsilon after generating the string. Okay, so basically here the language is all possible strings. There's no exception. Like in any string, I can basically choose one bit at a time. If it starts with 0, I'm going to apply s to 0s. If it starts with 1, I'll apply s goes to 1s. And then just matching one bit at a time. And in the end, I'll replace it with epsilon. Whereas for the second example, I'm only going to be able to ever generate once. There's nothing, 0 does not appear on the right hand side. So it's not full. Okay. So We are saying this property of grammars is not computable, is uncomputable. And the mind-bending thing here is that an implication of this corollary. CFGs are not necessarily closed under negation. So what do I mean? Yeah, it's a semantic property, right? Because it only depends on what's the function the grammar is computing, and it wouldn't change even if I add some dummy rules or dummy variables. The entire function is not going to change. And when the function doesn't change, the language doesn't change, and is full would not change. Okay. All right. So I want to say that this as an important corollary, which is the context-free grammars are not necessarily closed under negation. It is kind of a weird thing, right? You know, almost any model that we've looked at was closed under negations. If F was computable, not F was computable within that model. That was true for circuits, that was true for DFAs, for NFAs, for Turing machines. But within the class of context-free grammars, that is not true. So what does this mean? That is, okay. So there is some grammar such that the negation of the function computed by the grammar is not context free. There's no way to like somehow flip the rules and, you know, make some simple tricks to get around that issue. And why am I saying this is like a corollary of is full being uncomputable? Mainly because it's like a contrapositive. Suppose that for every grammar, there was another grammar which computed its negation. Okay? Then the original grammar has a full language if and only if the flipped grammar would be empty. Okay? So that's one strange corollary of is full being uncomputable. So why? Suppose not. Okay, so if we could negate grammars, then okay. So suppose there was a grammar G bar which exactly computed north of FG. And you ask me to check whether or not the language of G is full. Checking whether the language of G is full is essentially equivalent to checking whether or not the language of G bar is empty. Right? If G is full, G bar would be empty, and vice versa. Right? Basically, if one is full, then the other is a complement, so it has to be empty. and like, somewhere in between. So if this were the case, then I can compute not empty and then just negate it to compute is full. But we know that this is uncomputable. This is computable. Implies a contradiction. Okay. So which is a strange thing for a model to satisfy, but it is true. It is what it is. If I ask you, if I gave you a program and ask you a string and ask you to check whether it is not in the language, you cannot do this by designing another context-free grammar. Okay, and there are lots of other semantic properties of context-free grammars which are computable and some are not computable. People have studied a lot of those things. Okay, so that's all I wanted to really say about context-free grammars. The main things are, so they are a nice important class of functions in programming languages, linguistics, and so on. And we saw more powerful than regular languages. And we also saw that some semantic properties are computable. Okay. And any questions about context-free grammars and what they do? You can, you can really dig deep and try and show, this result, isFull is uncomputable, is kind of hairy. You really have to show that you end up getting a reduction from halt on 0, given any Turing machine, somehow find a grammar which is full if and only if the machine halts. This is kind of complicated. Okay. And the closure property is also surprising. Here's a simple model, simple and natural looking model, which is not closed under negations. And the first such model that we're encountering. Okay. So that's all I wanted to say about context-free grammars. And let's go back to our discussion of Turing machines and computability. Okay. So here we have this thing, right? So far we built, like, we had this model of Turing machines, which was introduced by Turing in a seminal paper. And as powerful and as ingenious as that model is, we also saw limitations. So there are some tasks which cannot be computed by these Turing machines. But all of the tasks that we showed were uncomputable were some kind of quote-unquote meta questions. What do I mean? You're trying to compute a function which is about programs, right? We showed, for instance, that halt on 0 is uncomputable. That the input itself was a program. We're saying, okay, no program can decide if other programs can terminate. We also showed not empty of Turing machines is uncomputable. No program can decide if another program accepts some string or not. And then we generalized it to Rice's theorem. And even this isFull is a question about grammars. It's not something not to do with programs, right? So you might wonder, are there problems that do not deal with programs that are uncomputable? Okay. So what if I don't care about programs, but somehow I'm trying to solve some graph theoretic question? Are those things always solvable? Okay, and that is, in other words, are there somewhat more, perhaps less okay, actually let me not say natural because I don't think that applies here. Are there uncomputable functions that arise in other fields? Okay, so suppose there's some computational problem that came up in, maybe when we are trying to simulate some quantum computer or, some chemistry experiment, maybe in math. Are all of those things computable? Maybe if I'm not interested in reasoning about programs, but I'm only interested in computing about things that that occur in other sciences. Would all of those be uncomputable, or are there similar obstacles that we might face even in these other areas? And unfortunately, uncomputability need not be that rare. There are seemingly natural questions across many fields which turn out to be uncomputable. Okay, and what we will do in the remaining lectures is to look at one such example and dig deep into it. And this example has its own rich history and comes from this grand question that a famous mathematician, David Hilbert, asked in the 19th century. Okay, he asked, is every mathematical theorem provable? So he wanted to understand, is every mathematical theorem provable? And what we will see is, this was a huge question in mathematics at the beginning of the 19th century and 20th century. But given what we've done so far, we have all the formalism set up to answer this in 2 lectures. So Hilbert actually asked something very concrete. He had this great hope, in fact, not just him, but this was a strong belief across most natural sciences, that you take your favorite unsolved problem in math, then there should be some, maybe finite amount, whatever, maybe 100 years, 200 years, 400 years, there's some finite amount of time after which every mathematical problem should be solvable by a computer, by some kind of proof system. Okay, so he specifically said, take any definite unsolved problem, such as the existence of an infinite number of prime numbers. However unapproachable these problems may seem to us, and however helpless we stand before them, we have a firm conviction that their solution must follow by a finite number of purely logical processes. Okay, and we can emphasize what this finite number of purely logical processes should be. Now, given everything that we have done, we have a very rigorous way of asking this question. What does this mean? Is every mathematical theorem provable? Well, we can formalize it using the language of Turing machines. And, he also got very philosophical about this, because if he knew that if there are theorems that cannot be solved, how would you know whether or not the one you're working on is solvable, right? It can get hairy like that. Okay. And so what does he mean by this? He really meant the following. So in his view, math should have been something like this. You have some set of axioms, and you have some inference rules. Okay, meaning, okay, I start with 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 2 = 3, and all of those things, and some rules for it. And from this, given this, okay, so I code up this set of rules, and then I feed it into some computer or whatever you have, some algorithm, some procedure, some logical process, and all the theorems of math should follow. That was his grand belief. But unfortunately, as we'll see, this is not possible. And this was shown to be not possible in a really remarkable result of Gödel, who showed the following. There exist true theorems about natural numbers that cannot be proved. Okay, so there exist true theorems, statements that are indeed true, but they cannot be proved by whatever set of rules you have in mind. You start with your axioms and inference rules. There will be some theorem which would not follow from this set of rules, but it is true. You might think, okay, then I will add it to my set of inference rules and then proceed from there. Well, even then, there will be some true theorem that cannot be proved. There is always something out of the reach of the set of inference rules and proof system that you have built so far. You cannot just have something that will cover all cases. Okay, and this was really a landmark result in logic and mathematics. It's called the first incompleteness theorem. It's called Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. You might have heard of it. There's this book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, and that book is by Douglas Hofstadter. It digs really deep into connections between this theorem and many other things, music, and also on computability. Okay. Usually, if you're doing it in a math class, it would take a full, course to prove it. But given what we have, as I said, we can, if we ignore some small technical details, we already have everything set up to prove this. But first, whatever I'm saying so far sounds is very vague, very philosophical, a lot of mumbo jumbo maybe, because it's not concrete, right? When I say true theorems, that sounds like a tautology. A theorem means it's true. What does it mean to say true theorem? And what does it mean to say it cannot be proved, but also insist that it is true? Right? What is truth if you cannot prove it? Well, is every true statement provable, or only statements that can be proved true? Okay. So to address all these questions, we need to get a little formal. In particular, we need to figure out what is a theorem and what is a proof. Okay. And one of the things that you will see here is there is a lot to gain by separating these two things. Right. And this is also a something important philosophically, where you start with some collection of theorems and then you associate proofs to it. It's not that only things that you can prove are true. Okay. So we need to figure out these two central notions. Okay. So what is a theorem? So how would you codify? What should a theorem be? What do you think? Like, given what we've done so far, we are going to be very simplistic and at the same time very generic. So theorems equal a formal statement, right? Some statement, some succinct statement, a string in 0, 1 star. Okay. So every statement, everything for us is a binary string. So theorems themselves are also binary strings. You might write it down in English, you might use math to encode it, but at the end of the day, I can transform it into just a binary string. So for instance, let's say I write down the following. There are no n greater than or equal to 3, comma, integers x, y, z, such that x to the n plus y to the n equals z to the n. Okay. So this is, of course, the Fermat's last theorem, and it's a short sentence. We can just map it to some string, to some binary string. Okay. So that's what we have in mind. When a theorem is just a binary string, but there should be some structure we'd like to impose on this class of strings. Okay. And the main thing we'll do here is the following. Just to kind of ignore the structure for the time being and just say theorems are just statements in some language, right? So imagine all the true statements in math are just put in some language. That's my language. All these true statements in physics, that's another language. Okay. So theorems for us are just specified by some language, some sub-collection of binary strings. That's our abstract way of dealing with it. There may be additional properties that we want to or have to use, but at least for the time being, to set up the formalism, we can just say, I just have a collection of binary strings. Those are my theorems. And the goal is, if I give you a string from this, just do a binary string, you have to tell me whether or not this is true, right? Whether or not the input string belongs to this language or not. So we're kind of, again, making it a computational question, or at least seemingly computational. I want to check membership in this class of theorems that underlie my universe. They're coming from somewhere, and want to know if a specific string, aka theorem, is in L. Okay? Okay. True. So there is some underlying notion of truth as captured by this language that we have. Okay? It could be all things that are true in math, all things that are true in physics, whatever you have. So that takes care of formalizing what a theorem is. But what is a lot more tricky is what is a proof, right? So as I said, we are separating these two things, and that's an important conceptual idea, but it's not that unnatural, right? You're saying, okay, there's an underlying ground set of truths, and proofs are something different. Okay? Yeah? So string is just any so that's our interpretation. If the string is in the language, we think of it as a true statement. If it is not in the language, then it is not a true statement. So imagine I wrote down all the facts in the universe, right, as binary strings. That's my set of true statements. And someone comes up and says some other statement, like let's say pigs can fly. Okay? That's a statement that should not belong to the true statements category. Okay? That's our abstraction. There is underlying structure that we have to understand. But things like this would have taken philosophers and did take them thousands of pages to formalize what is truth, what is proof, and so on. But here, given a computational view, things are pretty natural to define. We have this underlying set of objects, which are some unknown language. And now I give you a string, you have to tell me or try and figure out whether or not this is part of the language. Okay? All right. So that's formalizing what is a theorem is a bit easier than what is a proof. But the definition of what is a proof is subtle, but also very important. Not just for understanding logic, but it shows up in all kinds of places in computer science. Okay? And if you know what bitcoins are, you might also seen this term proof of work. There are also, you're designing algorithms which are like proof systems, and they're much more advanced form. So the kind of proofs that we are going to study in the next lecture. Okay? So that's all for today. In the next class, we'll start talking about what is a proof and make our way towards proving that not all theorems are provable.